I'm Taylor Carik, a faculty member in Communications and Media Studies at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today I'm going to present about some of my work in and outside of academics and how the uprising here in Minneapolis following the murder of George Floyd and our recent opposition to the ICE occupation informs my research and writing. Here's where I'll be heading in this presentation, and just so you know, the section 1 is about half the presentation length and the other two go pretty quickly. So let's get into it. Back in 2018, the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis, a prominent local and international art gallery, cinema, performance space, and more, sort of like our little Guggenheim here in the Midwest, curated a large exhibition entitled Adios Utopia, which was a collection that looked at how, quote, Cuba's revolutionary epoch shaped 65 years of Cuban art. The Walker described the show by saying, although many artists have since emigrated from Cuba to live and work abroad, Adios Utopia focuses on the untold narrative of those who remained in Cuba and whose careers emerged or were educated on the island after Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. Through a selection of artworks created in the 6 decades since, the exhibition explores Cuba's artistic production, illuminating both dreams and deceptions contained within the revolutionary process and the idea of utopia. It was a good show, and it ended up touring to other art centers and museums throughout the country. In 2018, when the show debuted, if you remember back then, it was 2 years into the Trump presidency, and it wasn't great. There was a departure of all sorts of norms across the country, and the national zeitgeist got really into dystopias. Around the same time as Adios Utopia, this sticker came out from one of our arts organizations, mnartist.org, with their own sort of individualized, Americanized take on everybody gets their own dystopia. Our repertoire theater, the Trilon, held a 21st century dystopia film festival that I went to most of, and it was pretty good. Nationally, publications were grappling with the Trump administration's rush into dystopia. And during this time, as a news junkie, I was on social media quite a bit, seeing all sorts of insane headlines about how the country was going. So I started tagging things, hashtag Bienvenidos Dystopia. And by 2020, I had built up my own curated collection of headlines, anecdotes, and video clips with the hashtag, enough such that people, when they saw things that were dystopy, they would just send it to me. And since then, I have got hundreds and hundreds of different headlines and things in my own private archive that I've also screenshot. And really, the opposition here is framing it against the Walker's take from Adios Utopia and saying, hey folks, welcome to your dystopia. Two very crazy things happened with this, which was first and foremost, we're way past the projected timeline of most dystopian narratives. This is from a Super Nintendo game in 1994 that thought civilization would stop in 2010. This is The Crawl from Johnny Mnemonic with Keanu Reeves, put out in 1996, set in the future year of 2021. Not great. Ghost in the Shell from the Trilon series. Thankfully doesn't take place till 2029, so we still have this to look forward to. The second wild part was that here in Minneapolis in 2020, 2 years after I started doing the Welcoming to Dystopia, we had a pretty high profile civil rights murder where the racist police department murdered George Floyd. And in response to that, we also had sort of our own mini social collapse. That's the 3rd precinct from the police department that we burned down. It was 8 blocks from my house, and I had ash in my yard. It was pretty intense. In response to that, we started to see a lot of global image production and expressions, lots of different artworks that were produced from it from all over the country. Including some of my own artwork using the Bienvenidos Dystopia lens. This was the auto parts store that got burned down. This is a record store that got burned down. I printed these 4x3 posters and we pasted them around Minneapolis and had different summaries of the headlines that I had found. But as I collected more and more headlines and contemporary examples of tropes from dystopias that fit in narratives, it became more and more clear that the tropes were pretty much what we're living through today. And sorry to say, things have been getting more dystopian with improvements, or however you want to characterize new technologies. Yeah, again, not great. For example, corporate AI technology and its infrastructure and implementation make everyone's lives a nightmare. I'm sure you experience this at your own institutions. The headlines in the 8 years that I've been doing the project actually got even more crazy. You never would have thought, but here we are. So here's a general using his chatbot buddy to make decisions. Here's how the music industry is collapsing because of AI music and nobody's making any money. And then also we're under total surveillance in real life and online. So that's cool. It's brought to us by Target. ICE happened to also occupy the city of Minneapolis. They're still here, but we had the Metro Surge where we had actual jackboot thugs running around shooting people and arresting people, and I won't get too far into that. But I would like to also point out that William Gibson himself, sort of quasi-sci-fi dystopian, said that the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed, and so I always like to share this when I'm talking about dystopia, because we have to keep in mind race, class, gender considerations, whether or not we're experiencing the colonial boomerang, and other people's experiences with their own genocides and dystopias and how they've been able to move on. And some of the new Afrofuturist movements is also sort of can be framed this way. But anyway, back to Bienvenidos Dystopia. We actually started doing in-person sort of as a jab to the Walker Arts Center, our own exhibitions of multidisciplinary artists, framing them as sort of massively underfunded post-revolutionary art that people were already kind of doing. We also held some salons. And through this process, I got to know an artist here in Minnesota named Waylon Polikoff, who is, in addition to being a great artist, also a very good dude. And his work looks at the genealogy of depictions of state-backed violence against minority groups. He draws on imagery, iconography, and symbolism from the 19th century paintings of violence against Native Americans in Minnesota and the Midwest, to civil rights imagery from the 60s and 2020s, to even social media postings of the ongoing and escalating violence against Palestinians. He then uses the genealogy to position his work directly in the same lineage, but from a critical and oppositional perspective. It's very cool. What struck me about Waylon's approach, and something we've discussed quite a bit, is the gap between discrete physical representations and imagery, say of paintings, and the molecular smooth nature of, say, Instagram posts. And for example, when I started tagging headlines under Bienvenidos Dystopia, most of the collection that I have is no longer online. And so Waylon really turned me on to the importance of screen grabbing as a way of creating an archive to help institutionalize memory. We'll get to that in a second, but shout out to the Internet Archive that published an entire book about the vanishing culture of digital communications. This insane study from the Pew Research Center that talked about the effects of enshittification on the internet. And each day there's a new update to this trend, which thanks to AI slop, essentially means that the majority of content on the internet right now is AI generated and terrible. So that's sort of a look at how I got into dystopia. I'm not a English or critical literature person. I'm more of a media studies person. But I did get really into dystopic narratives and what they can mean for cultural studies and theory. So back to the Walker Art Center, which I'm not trying to rag on, they're just very prominent here in Minneapolis. None other than filmmaker Werner Herzog came to do a Regis dialogue in 1999 with the late, great Roger Ebert. That Regis dialogue is actually available online, but before they got into discussion, Herzog delivered what's become sort of a notable manifesto of sorts that directly challenged the purview of contemporary documentary filmmaking about empirical facts and a deeper aesthetic truth. Herzog's speech, dubbed the Minnesota Declaration on Fact and Truth, was a manifesto, and he rejected cinema verite, or truthful cinema, in favor of curated, even at times maybe fabricated, illuminations of deeper messages and meaning. Here's his first bullet, which confounds fact and truth and plows only stones. And yet, facts sometimes have a strange and bizarre power to make their inherent truth seem unbelievable. Facts create norms, and truth illumination. He has since added more to his declaration, but I read, when I went back to his Minnesota Declaration and his entire Regis dialogue, as his counter-positioning of this sort of grouping of facts and textual linear history and ecstatic truth from sort of my media studies background, and it became really helpful in analyzing texts and also sort of the social political context with technology for the things I've been screen grabbing to try and make an archive. So let's real quick take a pick of dystopian story endings. Here's Fahrenheit 451, which ends about memory. 1984 ends with memory. Here's The Giver, that ends with memory. The entire book, The Memory Police, is about memory. And my so what for my presentation is, if memory is so central to dystopian stories, and we're currently in a dystopia, as evidenced by my Bienvenidos Dystopia work, what are we to think about some of the fundamental questions around memory, our media objects, our technologies, our archives, the internet as an archive, and more? And in this framing, how can we be necessarily oppositional, and how does curation play into this? Okay, part 3, theoretical implications for all our cultural studies folks out there. Within the last 25 years, much of our relationship to each other and technology and our media objects has changed rapidly, throwing us into a state of dystopia. See the rest of the presentation. So what are the theoretical lines of inquiry that we can draw here? Well, of course, we need to look into some of these contemporary events from our theoretical lens. We can, of course, go back to Foucault and his concepts of memory, archive, subjectivity, oppositionality, his discursive function of the archive. I recently read a paper that I quite enjoyed that reframed him as one of the original digital theorists because of his presuppositions about how discursive rules fit solidly within our programmatical society. We have to talk about Derrida, of course, and the sickness and the madness of the archive. But one quote that stuck with me from Derrida is, "It is the future that is at issue here, and the archive as an irreducible experience of the future." Which reminded me of Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, who famously said, "The Instagram generation, me, now experiences the present as an anticipated memory." There's also new interest in the work of theorist Willem Flusser and his approach to technology that differentiates not only traditional imagery from what he calls technical imagery, but his proto-cybernetics approach. He says, due to our use of the computer, we recognize the memory function as a mode and not a thing. That could be real fun to look into. And even more importantly, in the last 20 years, we see the influential work of theorists like the great N. Catherine Hales, who squarely situates our contemporary subjectivity in a materialist cybernetic framework of technogenesis, where our offloaded memory, individual and cultural, on the internet directly impacts our cognition and agency. We all oh, if the internet's our collective memory and it's quickly restructuring, what's the impact of us? If this were a dystopian narrative, how would that impact our own affect as humans? We also have other media theorists like Wolfgang Ernst, who contrasts the temporality of a broadcast schedule for programming on television to a readily available on-demand nature of a streaming archive that changes our the way we interface with memory, but also agency in time and spatiality. Pretty dystopic. And last, I'd love to mention theorists like Raffaella Braccolini, who I think so accurately reads dystopias, including our own present dystopia, through the lens of anamnesis, an erasure of memory by information overload, and questions about what is true and what isn't, which Herzog is just released a book about. And then also Jody Dean, who argues that in our present form of, quote, communication capitalism, the content of a message, truth or misinformation, matters less than its circulation. And the connection here to Herzog's concepts of norms and illuminated truths, things that are directly demonstrable as facts versus, say, things that are constantly in circulation to provide meaning, are very robust. And so my end point here is sort of in a technologically mediated subjectivity. Dystopia isn't just the loss of corporal memory, but also the loss of expressions as memory. So if we're living our lives for Instagram and it all goes away, are we impacted as the protagonists of our own dystopia? I would like to end really quick with Paul Schmelzer, the editor of the Walker Reader, which was an online magazine at the Walker about 3 months ago. While I was working on this presentation, had an update that they redid the Walker website, which he edited for, I think, 10 years, and now you can't even find anything he wrote. So it seemed like a fitting end to the loss of memory and the importance of having our own archives and our own critical distance from the material so we can be oppositional. And then a quick coda. I just have to share, because this is a cultural studies group, that my family and I went and saw Sheep Detectives when it came out in the theater. And it's like literally all about this. So I recommend seeing that and thinking through where we are in our own dystopia as sheep. So that's it. Thank you.